I'm going to be presenting some research that I've done in collaboration with Carcross Tagish First Nation, which is a First Nation that has traditional territory in Yukon and British Columbia. And over the course of my career, I've had the honor and privilege of working in and around the topic of Indigenous water governance for over 15 years. So I started doing this work during my master's research in Alaska in partnership with Ruby Tribal Council for a Koyukon tribe in Ruby, Alaska. And the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council was also a partner on that research. And so through working with them, I met a number of Yukon First Nations who are involved with the Watershed Council because they work with tribes and Canadian First Nations within the Yukon River watershed. And so we wrote some grants, and I worked on a grant-funded project for a number of years after my master's, which introduced me to working with Carcross Tagish First Nation and several others who continue to be partners on my PhD research once I started at UBC. So I still work with Carcross Tagish First Nation today, and so I'm going to be presenting work that we have completed since I graduated from my PhD, although it draws on that PhD research. So yeah, I'm honored to be presenting some work that Colleen James, who is a knowledge keeper and citizen of Carcross Tagish First Nation, and I have worked on in partnership with CTFN. So before getting started, I want to acknowledge that the in-person portion of this conference is taking place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I am coming to you today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Innuak, Inishinuak, Dakota Oyate, Denisulene, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. So as I was mentioning, I lived and worked on Coast Salish territory for the better part of a decade during my PhD and subsequent postdoc. So I want to acknowledge the waters in those territories and the many things that they taught me. Here in Winnipeg, I want to acknowledge that my drinking water comes from the Winnipeg Aqueduct, which was constructed in 1919 to bring water from Shoal Lake to urban Winnipeg, very much at the expense of the water security of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. If you want to learn more about it, there's a historian who works at U of M named Adele Perry, and she has a book called Aqueduct. Just a little book there, but super informative about the construction of the aqueduct and the subsequent effects on the First Nation. So this is a picture of Colleen James and I taken just 2 weeks ago. We were together at the Nibe gathering. It's an Anishinaabe water gathering, which takes place in the White Shell here in Manitoba annually. So Colleen had come down to share some of our research with folks there. And so we don't have that many pictures together. It's always pictures I've taken of her, pictures she's taken of me. So we made a point of getting some pictures taken with the beautiful water there. Colleen is really the heart and soul of this work. It could not be done without her. So in this presentation, I will try to do justice to it without her. Any mistakes in the presentation are my own. So continuing with acknowledgements to the water itself in Carcross Tagish First Nations traditional territory. This is a picture of Teslei-Meni or Teslei-Ai or Pike Lake in the Tagish and Tlingit languages. So Tagish and Tlingit are the two languages that Carcross Tagish First Nation people speak. I want to acknowledge the CTFN Water Committee, and I'll be talking a lot more about that committee and their work in this presentation. I also want to acknowledge the CTFN water team, which is comprised of CTFN staff as well as external partners. So people like Rita Johns, Amaya Hilsharian, Scotty and Darian Tisa, as well as Etta Mutter from the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council. And then also to acknowledge that work is funded through the Canada Research Chairs Program and Polar Knowledge Canada grant. In the middle here, you see the logo for my research lab. If you want to check out some of the work that myself and some of my students are doing, just Google that Environmental Governance and Change Lab and you'll find my website. So it sounds like this presentation is very much continuing in themes that you've been addressing throughout the conference. I'm going to be focusing a bit more, on governance. So Indigenous peoples around the world are working to revitalize their Indigenous water laws and governance systems. These very much center on this notion of Indigenous peoples having inherent water rights and responsibilities to water as a living entity. And so I use this picture here to kind of illustrate this a little bit, primarily revolving around this idea of respecting water. So this picture is from 2019 during the Yukon Waters Forum. And Yukon government approached Carcross Tagish First Nation to co-host a meeting of water managers from across the territory. So these water managers came from various levels of government, as well as First Nation governments, some not-for-profits, etc. And Colleen, James, and I were on the organizing committee, and Colleen suggested that the whole two-day event should be organized around a water ceremony. So that meant that everybody gathered and brought their waters together, including not only the water in their bodies, but water from the places that they came from. And those waters were gathered into this vessel here and sat with us for 2 days, listening to us and engaging in the conference or in the meeting. And then the final part of the meeting was to return the water to Taslay, which I showed you a picture of before. And so, yeah, just very much centering the whole meeting that people of Indigenous and non-Indigenous origins were participating in around this idea of water ceremony and respecting water. In the foreground, you see Elder Jean Damaris, who is on our water committee. Susanna is one of our youth, who's also on the water committee. And I'm forgetting this youth's name, but they were a high school student who was presenting their research on microplastics, which was very impressive. But so Indigenous water governance is very much about, this idea of how to better respect and protect water as a living entity, and thinking about the ways that the ability to enact these relationships is very much shaped by both historical and ongoing colonialism. And so I've, kind of touched on this, but you have this question of what is water that's really shapes a lot about governance, water governance. And so the answer to this question might seem very simple, coming from like a Western, educated background. Water's H2O, water, cycles through the familiar processes of the hydrologic cycle. But from an Indigenous perspective, and generally speaking, water is much more than that. Water is simultaneously social and political, and for Indigenous peoples, it is alive and has spirit. And so we need to shift our thinking of it away from this resource mentality. So I think I'm speaking to a pretty interdisciplinary crowd. And so just making sure, to define, what am I talking about when I'm talking about governance or water governance? So it's about a set of regulatory processes, mechanisms, and institutions through which political actors influence environmental decisions, actions, and outcomes. So it is not just about state governments or the Canadian federal government or territorial provincial governments, but it's the actors beyond that, which have historically been excluded. So governance acknowledges that new actors, institutions, and knowledge systems are reshaping decision-making processes about the environment. In itself, governance is a fairly neutral term. Some folks have called it a malleable term because people can use it in different ways to mean different things. So I think it's good to be explicit that I'm really interested in kind of power inequalities and injustices within these systems. Whose knowledge and kind of rights are privileged and why. And so a water justice lens helps me do that. So water justice acknowledges the differing, unequal, and disproportionate ways water insecurity affects human communities. It highlights the needs to develop responses to various stressors that address injustices in a fair and equitable manner. It also prompts us to ask questions, very useful questions. Who benefits, who loses, in what ways, where, and why? And so you can, I draw on work by professors at UBC, like Layla Harris, who I've worked with a lot over the years, people like Farhana Sultana, Rutger Bolens, Gina Zervin. And Indigenous scholars are increasingly also using this framework and also critiquing kind of more mainstream environmental justice and water justice lenses. So this image is taken from a paper called Water Back, which is authored by a collective of Indigenous scholars led by Kelsey Leonard. And it's published in Water Alternatives. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go get the paper and read it. This illustration by Hawali Pichete shows the themes that are kind of addressed in the paper, including water justice. So in particular, they say that Indigenous water justice recognizes that water is a living entity. In doing so, water justice moves beyond conceptualization solely focused on fairness, equity, and participation of humans in water decision-making to also acknowledge relationality. It asks, what does the water need? What does the water need? So it's moving away from this idea that it's about justice for humans to also think about justice for water itself. So moving away from a, really anthropocentric framing. And so I think drawing on some of the dimensions of environmental justice or water justice identified in the literature is useful here. We have things like distributional, procedural, recognitional, and restorative justice. And these each kind of allow us to ask certain questions. So one of the main ways that water justice is addressed is through distributional justice, which is about which asks how are entitlements, benefits and harms to water distributed, say amongst the population. So in environmental justice, this is a lot about issues of concerns about siting. Where are facilities sited or located relative to marginalized communities? But these other pillars help us kind of expand beyond that to ask questions like, who or what is valued or respected in decision-making? Who is involved or has influence? What process is used to make decisions? And then for restorative justice, what needs to be done to repair the harm? Who is responsible for this repair? And so again, from an anthropocentric perspective, you would answer these in one way, but when you center water as a living entity, you might ask and answer these very differently. And so drawing on these, I'll be kind of engaging with some of the collaborative research that I've done with Carcross First Nation related to water. So the objective of this talk is to engage with this water justice framework to examine the value of Tagish and Tlingit water relations, practices, and law for decolonizing water governance. So here you have on display my fabulous cartography skills. This is just an image from Google Earth. I was just at a conference in Norway, and so for an international audience, just to show where Carcross Tagish's traditional territory is located in a global sense. And I purposely did not put any borders on here because borders are imposed. They don't really mean anything to water. And they don't mean anything. They're imposed on Indigenous peoples as well. And so, it's nice to kind of look at things in this way. When working with Carcross Tagish First Nation, of course, borders matter deeply for water governance. You can see the line in the middle of their traditional territory, which is the Yukon-BC border, which, very much is a factor in how they're able to protect waters within their territory. And so the governance arrangements differ on each side of the border, even though they're within the same nation state. So in Yukon, we have the final agreements. So there are 14 Yukon First Nations, 11 of them have these final agreements or modern treaties. They're comprehensive land claim agreements that were negotiated after 1973. So they look very different to what you might think of as the numbered treaties, which were negotiated before 1973, or unceded territory, such as in the southern portion of their territory. It's very similar to much of British Columbia, where there's no treaties. So these modern treaties, or the final agreement that CTFN has a whole chapter about water management. It acknowledges things like the right to unaltered water quality, quantity, and rate of flow, including seasonal flows on or adjacent to settlement lands, and settlement lands, which are not pictured on this map, but they're equivalent to roughly 10% of their traditional territory, and they're the lands to which they retain title. Also acknowledged in the chapter are things like the right to traditional use, these agreements saw the creation of several co-management boards, including the Yukon Water Board. So the Yukon Water Board actually predates land claims, but was made into a co-management board as a result. And this means that Yukon First Nations, through the Council of Yukon First Nations, can appoint memberships for 1/3 of that board. Yukon government does the same for another third, and the federal government for another third. Those people do not represent their own community, but they are part of the kind of decision makers for the board. Most co-management boards in Yukon have advisory status, which means the board has to consider all the evidence and make a recommendation, but it's ultimately up to the decision body, which is most often Yukon government, to accept, reject, or vary those recommendations. The Yukon Water Board is kind of the exception where they are a decision body. I've looked at this kind of extensively in one of the papers for my PhD, so I won't go much more into detail about that here, but it's important to note that these modern treaties very much shape water governance in Yukon. They also acknowledge something called the laws of general application. So that means that colonial laws, say related to water or otherwise, still apply within their territory, similar to how they do in British Columbia. So in Yukon, one of the primary pieces of water legislation is the Yukon Waters Act of 2003. And then, of course, I'm sure you know, being in British Columbia there, that we have the BC Water Sustainability Act, which was enacted in 2016. So with the goal of revitalizing Tagish and Tlingit water law to better protect water, we have this idea of Heen 2 governance. So Heen 2, that's water in Tlingit and Tagish. And when we say governance, we don't mean governing water, we mean governing human behavior in relation to water. And so navigating this complex context, there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had. I really love this picture. It's just like a very spontaneous hallway discussion that happened, I think, probably in 2018. You can see my handwriting on that board, Colleen James and Mark Wedge, who are both elder advisors to the First Nation, talking about this, in the hallway one day. So many things like that. So I'll be sharing a bit more about this. First, I want to go to some of the critiques of water governance, particularly related to the final agreements or the modern treaty in Yukon, because it goes to some of the limitations that people are dealing with. So there's several key critiques that are dealt with in a lot more detail in the papers noted at the bottom. The three of them came out of my PhD work, but critiques of kind of co-management is a very limited form of shared decision-making. I was just briefly describing how it works. Within co-management, First Nations are not decision makers, but it does give greater ability to participate in decision-making. Decision-making, I think, or the ability to acknowledge Indigenous jurisdiction and authority as decision makers is very much limited by colonial governance arrangements, in particular through this idea of Crown jurisdiction over water. And so what is Crown jurisdiction? At the time of colonization, it's basically this idea that when settlers showed up, that there's this idea of terra nullius, the lands were empty, and so they belonged to the settlers who were able to claim them. And this is similar with water. So there's this Australian Indigenous scholar named Virginia Marshall who coined this term aqua nullius, or nobody's water. So this is a parallel to terra nullius, just saying that, well, when settlers arrived, water didn't belong to anybody. And so it belongs to the Crown, and via the Crown, the federal government and provincial governments who authorities are divided based on the heads of power under the Canadian Constitution Act. And so you see this reflected in these laws of general application. You'll see this in the Water Sustainability Act as well, but it says water belongs to government. So this very much shapes kind of everything about authority and decision making. It also, there's this critique of land claim agreements. I should say that people are very proud of these agreements. They work very hard to negotiate them, and there's many good things in them. But yes, these are critiques that people have also shared with me. This idea that in order to implement the agreements, the governance arrangements that come out of that are still very much based on settler institutions and supporting ideologies. So almost like First Nations need to set their governments up in ways that kind of mirror like a mini Yukon government. And one of the things that people talked about is the ways that both institutions and processes of the institutions very much are centered around this idea of water as a resource. And again, going back to this notion that water belongs to government, you can kind of see that reflected. So yeah, those are just a few of the critiques that CTFN is kind of pushing back against in developing their governance approaches. So one of the things that CTFN has done is that they have built their governance structure based on their clan system. So I'm sure being in British Columbia, you're familiar with you know, some nations that have also have clan systems. So for CTFN, there are 6 clans. They're divided into wolf and crow moieties. So this picture is of the CTFN Learning Center, or the Hashigun Hidi. And out front, there are 6 clan poles. So listing them from left to right, we have Duckluidi or killer whale, Kokatan crow, Yanyeti wolf, Ganakteti crow with a worm in their mouth, Ishkatan frog, Deshitan split-tailed beaver. So on all of the governing committees that CTFN has, or governing bodies and committees, they are clan-based, so there's representation from each of these 6 clans. For example, with their executive committee, they have the Kashada Hen, or the chief, and then representation from each of the 6 clans. So that's similar with the CTFN Water Committee. So this committee was created by a decision of the Carcross Tagish First Nation Land Management Board in 2019. So originally, the committee, according to a decision document that was issued by the Land Management Board, was supposed to be set up to create the terms of reference for a piece of water legislation. One thing I should have mentioned earlier is that CTFN is a self-governing First Nation. They're not under the Indian Act. They have the ability to develop their own legislation, and they are. They have, when you're self-governing in the way that they are, they have what's often called province-like power. So they have many of the same authorities as provinces. When the kind of decision document was issued, they said, okay, so we want you to create a water committee to develop the terms of reference for a piece of legislation. The committee must be clan-based. It has to represent all 6 clans. It has to have elders, and it has to have youth. It also has to be gender balanced. So you'll notice in this picture, there aren't any youth there, but there are 4 youth and 6 elders that are on the committee. I'm using this picture because even though the youth aren't in it, they were at Swiftwater Rescue that day. Also a really important thing to be doing. But I'm using this picture because it's really important. This was taken last July at our one of our water workshops that I'll talk more about in a moment. And we had with us that day the last 2 fluent Tlingit speakers who are citizens of Carcross Tagish First Nation, including Ida Calmegan in the front and Norman James. Norman James was Colleen's uncle, and he passed away shortly after this meeting. So it was very special to us. And so, yeah, I'll be sharing a little bit more about our work. Before that, I want to center us a little bit more in terms of what water means to people from CTFN with a few quotes. So this is a quote from an interview I did with Colleen James in 2012. So I can remember sitting on the shores of Chutla Lake interviewing her, and she said, water is important to me because it's the stuff of life. Without it, life can't go on. And I think it's important to all life on the planet. And I try to share that with the family. They know that it's the stuff of life, very important, and to treat it like a relative and to treat it good and to appreciate it. And so Colleen's thinking and her knowledge about this has very much shaped my own knowledge and thinking about it. So I want to acknowledge that. Also in 2012, I was able to interview the late Stanley James, and he shared some information that I didn't understand at the time. In these two simple sentences, he summed up so much. I didn't understand the clan system very much, and this concept of respecting water, I needed to think a lot more about to understand. So he said, the laws we have for water in the clan houses, those kinds of things are important because we need to respect water. So what does that mean? The clan houses, each of the 6 clans that I mentioned, all hold very particular knowledge in the form of songs, stories, etc. And we need to work with the clans to understand those in order to respect water. And this idea of respecting water is very much centers around this idea of water as a living entity, and particular kind of ways we need to relate to it. This is a quote by the late Winnie Atlin. I did not conduct this interview, but Colleen thought it was really important to share. It's linked on the How We Walk with the Land and the Water website, which is a collaboration that Carcross Tagish has with Ta'an and Kwanlin Dun First Nation. It's super interesting. You should check it out. I won't have time to kind of explain it here, but it's essentially their answer to land use planning and water management in Yukon. So when he says wushin yechu tauni haga kuklatin, so if we work together, we're going to be strong. So this idea that of wushin, we got to work together, comes up all the time. And when they say we got to work together, it's not just amongst CTFN, but talking about working with other nations and any other party who shares their vision. Finally, again, Norman James, who was Colleen's uncle at the workshop in 2019. So the first water committee workshop was in 2019, and Colleen suggested we hold one day before the Yukon Water Forum and one day after. So that's what we did. And the day before the Yukon Water Forum, Norman James shared, we were saying, like, what do we need to do to protect water in your are the things we need to know how to protect water. First Nation quoting it regularly. So a few more things. We have the CTFN water strategy. We've had 3 workshops. You'll notice a bit of a blip there. There were a few things happening in the world between 2019 and 2022. What I'll say about this is I'm not sharing particular elements of the strategy because it's still in process, but you can see kind of our methods for creating a vision, principles, and goals and strategic priorities. The important thing in this picture, among many things, is that Colleen always makes sure that we have waterman at the table. So you can see there's a piece of paper standing up there, and it's about having water itself having a seat at the table to help us ground us in our responsibilities and commitments. Other people sometimes talk about this as saving a chair for kind of those who can't speak for themselves. And so, yeah, that's always kind of present, and Colleen kind of makes sure it's there. We also, in 2013, had a planning meeting with the CTFN water team to help develop an action plan that will do this, just that, action the strategy that we're developing. This is where we're at right now. Yes, it looks all clean and linear. We just spent this year doing presentations to the various governing bodies. Most of them asked us to come back a second time because they needed more time to digest what we shared. And so, yes, it looks very clean and linear, but actually it's been like this. So this project and these types of collaborations have really changed how I think about and work. So, you know, coming from this kind of Western educational background, being like very linear and thinking things need to go in a particular way, you know, when you've got your like project management software going on there, but it's not, it's iterative, it's non-linear. You need to adapt how you work. So overall, you know, there's, if you take one thing away, it's thinking about these questions and how we can answer them very differently when we think about water as a living entity. Some of the implications about this, decolonization involves more than a struggle just against power and control. It's also about imagining and generating alternative institutions and relations. So what is it that people desire, and how are we going to get there? Glenn Coulthard, who many of you may know, professor at UBC, argues that we need to move beyond seeking recognition from settler states by critically reevaluating, reconstructing, and redeploying Indigenous cultural forms that seek to prefigure alongside those with similar ethical commitments, radical alternatives. So whatever side of debates about recognition you fall on, this idea that we need to prefigure justice is important. And so been having a lot of discussions about prefigurative politics with Colleen, and she's been having discussions with other people about that in Yukon. But essentially, in the most simple terms, it's about being the change you wish to see. Boggs talks about this as the embodiment within the ongoing political practice of a movement, of those forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal. So while we might not know exactly, we might have a goal and we might not know exactly how to get there. We need to enact this kind of relationality of water as a prefigurative practice. Colleen often says, you got to act like you've got it. So this idea of thinking about self-determination, sovereignty, and relationships with water, you just got to act like it now, because that's the only way you're going to get where you want to go. So out of all that, yeah, we're working on a number of papers, probably a methods paper and another one more governance-wise. I think kind of generally, like for this audience, I wanted to say that this kind of work, it's something you can only learn by doing it. And interdisciplinary scholarship is very much needed to support Indigenous self-determination in water governance. I often have these engagements or discussions with folks more on the natural science or STEM side of things who think that this type of community-based research is what social scientists do, when it's something that natural scientists really need to build their capacity in as well. It's not just the domain of social scientists or humanities scholars who do social research, so we should be good at having these types of relationships. So you'll see pictured here a couple of articles I highly recommend you take a look at if you're coming from more of the natural science background. But they basically ask, how can the natural sciences support truth and reconciliation? The Wong et al. Article has several, I think 10 calls to action for natural scientists about how to do this in your work. So overall, it's about, reflecting on how your research and practice helps enact Indigenous peoples' desired futures. Of course, you need to engage with Indigenous peoples to know what they are, but things like, truth and reconciliation and the goal of self-determination tell us about that. So yeah, I'll just leave you with that. And in conclusion, just to say that water justice helps us to think not only about what we want, but how we get there, the kind of procedure, the restorative aspects of it. What do you do when harm has already been done? Who's responsible for undoing it once harm has been done? What procedures should be followed? And so generally speaking, thinking about how governance processes reflect and revitalize Indigenous water laws, relationships, and values. And maybe for your own work, it's not specifically governance processes, but your research process and method itself. And so, yeah, ask yourself, how are we centering relationships with water as a living relative according to the people that we're working with? So I could go on all morning about this, but I wanted to say, for those who are looking for examples of people who are doing this kind of interdisciplinary research with Indigenous peoples, it was mentioned at the beginning, but I co-chair the United Nations Academic Impact Hub for Sustainable Development Goal 6 at the University of Manitoba. So we're a group of interdisciplinary scholars from across campus, from the social sciences, humanities, STEM fields. And we have this speaker series called The Last Drop that has run for the last 2 years, and we're in the process of preparing the upcoming year. But all of the talks are recorded, posted on YouTube and linked on our website. So you can just see a sampling of the presentations from last year. People like Ayush Kumar, M.A. Kraft, Zuzu Cusick, Claire Herbert, Deborah McGregor, Melanie O'Gorman, and Stuart Hill. So yeah, check those out. There's a lot of good content there. So yeah, in conclusion, I guess I'll just say Ganesh Sheesh, Soga Sanyala, and leave you with this picture again of Tusley Many or Pike Lake, but in a different season. So thank you.